Okay, let's get this going. Grab your Taco Bell if you're eating that or whatever it is you're having. I ate early, so I wouldn't have to eat in front of you. But welcome. Thanks for being here. My name is Andy Moore. I am the Executive Director of Freedom of Information Oklahoma. We're very excited for you to join us today for our first in a series of Lunch and Learns we're going to do throughout this year. And this one, we're going to start at the very beginning. We're going to talk about the Open Records Act and the Open Meeting Act and really kind of just lay it out there. And then in subsequent Lunch and Learns throughout the year, we're going to address, to kind of take deeper dives into topics like where does transparency intersect with education, with healthcare? Gosh, that's been a hot topic in the last year. We'll do some more conversation around the Open Meeting Act and virtual meetings and what that looks like, over the past year and now moving forward, which is particularly salient given the fact that Governor Stitt ended the state of emergency just in the last couple of weeks and what implications that has for public boards to meet and maybe what we might expect to see or hope to see in the future. We'll also talk about where Transparency and Open Records Act intersects with law enforcement. I'll be honest, that's the bulk of the questions that I get on any given week is from people that are trying to get access to their own records or, body cam videos or other security videos, those kinds of things. A lot of stuff dealing with law enforcement. I know that will be a hot topic. All that to say, we'll get there when we get there. If you are new to us by some chance, a little bit about Freedom of Information Oklahoma. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that was founded, a little over 30 years ago for the purpose of raising awareness and advocating for government transparency in Oklahoma. We have a very diverse board of journalists and attorneys and folks in the library system and then just regular folks, right, who care about transparency, who believe and know that the public has a right to records, and we have a right to oversee, to be involved, or at least keep an eye on how our government works. And we try to raise that up, right, and push transparency. I think we've got a lot of history in this country and elsewhere that shows that when there is more transparency and more accountability, you get better government, and that's what we all want, right? So joining us today is Beth Gardner. Beth is with the local legal initiative and a staff attorney here based in Oklahoma. We are proud to be a member of a consortium of organizations that received funding, that basically pays for Beth to be here with us in Oklahoma. And so it's part of the Reporters Committee for the Press. She joined them coming from Tulsa. She was with an organization called Still She Rises. And she is the first that was the first holistic defense office in the country dedicated exclusively to the representation of both mothers in the criminal and the civil legal systems. Beth received her Juris Doctoral from the University of Oklahoma College of Law, where she was captain of the Civil Rights Moot Court Team and an editor of the Oklahoma Law Review, which she was twice named Outstanding Member. Before attending law school, she had various roles in the nonprofit sector. We're going to do a topic about transparency and open meetings and open records with nonprofits as well coming up, because I know many of you work in nonprofits and that is particularly important. And she helped launch a nonprofit called Aspiring Americans to help connect Oklahoma's undocumented student population with opportunities for success. She's a graduate of Leadership Oklahoma and an active member of her community. The Tulsa County Bar Association named her to their 2019-2020 Outstanding Young Lawyer in recognition of her reputation as a lawyer dedicated to service in the profession and the community. Gosh, I wish that my bio read as outstanding as that. Beth, thanks for being here with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Andy. I'm excited to join everybody today and talk about this important topic.
Yeah. Well, I know we emailed about this, but for the benefit of our audience, do you want to just have a conversation about open records and open meeting and kind of walk it out through there? Or do you have remarks prepared that you'd like to share?
No, I think a conversation would be great. And I'm very interested in hearing from the audience. If anybody has any questions or points that they would like for us to address, feel free to notify us in the chat and hopefully we can get those addressed as well.
Yes, very much. We will save time at the end for questions. So please feel free to chime in there. All right, well, to start, let's talk about where this all came from, where these laws started. And maybe it is important to make a distinction right up front, right? That there are some laws that govern federal issues and other laws that govern state issues, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's laws that pertain to the federal freedom of information and people's rights as it relates to the federal government. That is helpfully called the Freedom of Information Act. That's kind of the main law that the main federal law that gives you rights to know what the government is doing in your name and with your taxpayer dollars. And what we are primarily talking about today is what those laws look like on the state level. So here in Oklahoma, two of the primary laws that concern freedom of information are the Oklahoma Open Records Act and the Open Meetings Act. And I think it's also important to note that since we are in Oklahoma and there are many tribal nations located within the boundaries of our state, that the state open records laws don't apply specifically to those nations. As sovereign nations, they get to make their own laws and regulations surrounding things like this. So it's important to note that what we're discussing today would not, for example, apply directly to maybe the Cherokee Nation or something like that. We're talking about how this affects the State Department of Education, how it might not affect things like the legislature. That's kind of what our discussion is about today.
Yeah, that's great. Now, you mentioned tribal governments, and I'm glad you did. There are some there are some tribal nations who do have open records and transparency laws, right? Just the state laws don't apply to the tribes.
Absolutely. That's an important point, Andy. As sovereign nations, they get to, an essential component of that is creating their own laws and own governments. And many of the tribal nations have their own freedom of information laws that are sometimes modeled on maybe the state laws here in Oklahoma or the Federal Freedom of Information Act. And it is something that varies from tribe to tribe.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, I think for the purposes of this, because we are based in Oklahoma, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the Oklahoma laws in particular. But audience, if you have questions about federal laws or tribal laws for that matter, feel free to ask them and we'll answer if we know them. Katie Beth, when did Oklahoma adopt the Open Records Act and Open Meeting Act?
So the Open Records Act and the Open Meetings Act, they've been around for decades. We're looking back to the 50s and the 80s. So they've been around for decades. They both started out, I think, a shell of what they are now, in that they were kind of single paragraph or smaller actual written text of the law. And today, the Open Records Act is now an entire chapter of law with lots of different components talking about maybe different exceptions or policies and procedures, and kind of same for the Open Meetings Act. And a lot of that development is due to the fact that when you have a law that is maybe simple in its plain text, that leaves a lot open to the courts to determine maybe what it means when we're applying it to different situations. And I think especially now we're applying a lot of these things to digital technologies for the first time. So that is probably another reason that we're seeing as technology continues to advance, our government continues to advance, I think we'll continue to see kind of a development of the law and an expanse of its actual text from those kind of original first true paragraphs.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that obviously as the world turns and moves forward, most laws, including Open Records Act, Open Meeting Act, have to be able to evolve with the times. Because when they were written, we didn't have things like text messages and TikTok, right? Like these are all new technologies. And so looking at how we save, how we store, and how we transmit information, everything from court records to inmate information. In fact, the other day I was at the Oklahoma History Center and saw some of the like old from the 20s and 30s DOC like inmate cards, and some of the folks in our group joked that that's basically the same system they have today. So not everything is has kept with the times, but both that has impact on how organizations or agencies are able to pull information and provide it to the public. And well, I'm sure we'll get into that discussion here in a minute, but maybe let's start with the Open Records Act, and then we'll do open meeting second. Can you give us like a 30,000 foot view on what the Open Records Act does and what it covers?
Sure. So the Open Records Act is something that I deal a lot with, and it's essentially a law that really vests and gives power to the people to be able to exercise fully their political power. So it gives you rights as an Oklahoman to be able to request records of the government, to know what expenditures the government is making, what decisions they're making, what information is informing those decisions, what their policies and procedures are. And it lays out really how you kind of go about making requests, what a government body's responsibilities are for answering your request or providing you with information. And it's really broad. So the definition of a record fortunately includes many things like what Andy mentioned beyond just a piece of paper that might be present in a government office. It includes things like pictures, emails, text messages, anything that's really relating to government functioning or the transaction of public funds that can be considered a public record. And it's also really broad in who it applies to. So it doesn't just apply to maybe the State Department of Transportation. It applies all the way down to government entities like your local school district or your local town or municipality. So it's a great way that Oklahomans can become more informed about what their governments are doing and just gain information on that so that they can make decisions that are right for themselves and their communities.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a classic phrase, right, that all politics is local, and that people, I think it's natural that we think about large government agencies because maybe we see that in the news, right? Like the Department of Education or the Health Department or whatever, that they would be subject to open records. But it's a very good point that it does extend all the way down to even local stuff. And I will say a lot of the questions I get from just the public here at FOI Oklahoma are about city council meetings. And so maybe one question to specifically talk about it is the question of text messages, right? Are text messages sent by members of, let's say, a city council? Are those subject to open records, and where are the limits on that?
Yeah, I think it's important, as a lawyer, I would say that everything, turns on the facts of a particular case. But I think in the case where you're talking about government officials communicating about a government activity, maybe they're talking about making a decision on a initiative that's going to come up to the city council or something like that, I would absolutely argue that that is a record that should be a public record and should be disclosed so that we can be more fully informed about how our government is functioning. So it can get a little sticky in those situations, but absolutely there is precedent that would suggest that yes, text messages, if they're talking about government activities, would be public records.
Right. So maybe this is one reason we see some government entities recommend or require that staff have a separate work device to communicate about work things, not their personal device. So there's not that commingling of information, right? We just got a question that I was about to ask is, what about text messages that might occur during a meeting? You know, like you see two members texting, and if somehow you know they're texting one another, does it matter that it's happening during a meeting, even if they're texting about where they want to go eat afterwards?
Yeah, I think if it's something, I think this is where it gets tricky, but if it's, if we're on the city council and we're texting each other about like, hey, are we going to go to Chili's after this and get a hamburger together like we talked about last week? That might not directly be related to, public, like the public interest, like governance or things like that. So I think that's where you can see the lines tend to get a little blurry. But absolutely, if it's something like we're sitting there texting about like, wow, I can't believe what Counselor Johnson just said, like we're both going to vote no on this.
Right. Yeah.
That's certainly something getting into the area where it's in the public interest to know, to have a right to know about what's going on.
So how do we know, right? If I'm sitting in a council meeting and I see two people texting and I think they're texting each other, but obviously I can't see their screens, who decides if it's relevant and how does that access happen? Does it require going to court? I guess is my question.
So what you would do in that situation is probably file an open records request, and you would want to find information. So, let's say maybe we are city councilors in the city of Oklahoma City. They have their own policies and procedures. They have a nice online form that you can fill out and request information, and be very specific about, communications between councilors Gardner and councilors Moore about that took place at this time. And see what the city gives back to you. If they give you any information, they might say, yes, here is a copy of what you requested. They could say, we do have records, but we're not going to give them to you for XYZ reason. Or they could say, we undertook a search and nothing exists. Sorry, there's nothing to see here. And some of those instances, if you would like to challenge, like, for example, if they said, there are records, but we're not going to tell you what they are, they're exempt under the open records law due to, exemption A1, whatever, that definitely requires getting a lawyer and going to court.
Yeah. That's, sadly, I guess a lot of the people that contact me for help or guidance on some of these things, they're always like, here's all things I've tried. And they just keep saying no. What do I do? And it's like, well, sometimes a well-written letter from an attorney is enough to nudge things forward, which is certainly not in the spirit of the law, right? And I think as I'm sure we'll talk about here, as more and larger entities start getting dinged on that, right? Once they are held to account, the law does allow that the attorney can recoup their fee, right, as part of the thing. And so not only would the entity have to give up the records, but they have to pay for that attorney's time as well. That kind of hits people, in the purse, where I think for whatever reason, money is a motivator for a lot of state agencies, and smaller groups too, right? If city councils actually had to follow through on some of this stuff, I think we would see some of those that are bad offenders maybe improve, I would hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of an interesting measure that's supposed to be both a carrot and a stick.
Right.
A carrot in that they want interested lawyers or interested persons, if they want to go to court and represent themselves, pro se, to have the ability and the resources to do that. So I think that that's why we see that attorney fee shifting provision. And it's also a stick to hopefully encourage those public bodies to comply with the law going forward in the future, and not to make kind of that same mistake again.
Yeah. So I know we said we're going to have questions at the end, but we've gotten one already that is relevant now, and I think it makes sense to work it in. A minute ago, you mentioned that the state legislature is not subject to Open Records Act, right? If anyone follows me on social media, this is a point that I try to make regularly, right? That they wrote the laws and they exempted themselves. And so this would include their emails and their internal communications. But so that's a whole lunch and learn by itself, not for today. But what about state appointees, right? So people that the governor appoints, or the speaker or the pro tem, so maybe members of the State Board of Education, cabinet officials, those kinds of appointees, are they subject to open records?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I wanted to make sure I, pulled up the direct text of the Open Records Act. But a public official is really any employee or official of a public body as defined by the Open Records statute. So public bodies, I think the easiest way to think of it is that it is primarily anybody within the executive function of our state government. So, there's an executive, a legislative branch, our Oklahoma legislature, and then we have a judiciary, the Supreme Court, and the other courts in Oklahoma. And so anybody who really falls within that kind of executive branch, the State Department of Education, its board members, law enforcement, different things like that, they would fall within the coverage of the open records law and would be subject to it.
Yeah, so if you start with the governor at the top, anyone that kind of falls under that branch of government, which is pretty big, right? I had a conversation this week with someone from Rutgers University, oddly enough, but it was about the size of the government that people talk about, meaning like elected officials and primarily like the legislative branches, versus the size of the administrative bureaucracy, which is way larger, right? And all the agencies and all of the staff and the administrative work. And that is where I would say the bulk of government action happens, right? Like, and that all of that stuff is subject to open records then, correct?
Yes, for the most part, absolutely.
Super. Well, let's, since we're on this note, no, I'm going to come back to the question. We got a question earlier about Epic charter schools, and I know you have a role in that this week in particular. So we'll come back to that in the end, because I think those issues cross both open records and open meetings. So before that, let's talk about the Open Meeting Act. Can you give us the 30,000-foot view on that side?
Sure. So the essential kind of purpose of the Open Meeting Act, it's a law, and it requires that meetings of public bodies are open to the public, and that they are conducted according to notice that is provided to the public in advance. So, for example, that if we are city councilors, we have our regularly scheduled meetings, we make an agenda available so that if there are people who are in our community and want to come and speak with us about a certain initiative or item on the agenda, that they have the notice and opportunity to essentially be heard on that and participate in their government, and see it live in action. I think that this is a really powerful right. And I think that we see a wide interest that has been developing in the past few years of people who are really taking advantage of this and getting into their local government meetings and wanting to participate in the governance of their communities. And I think that's really excellent. And 100% that's facilitated by this law.
Yeah. So, one question we often get is, does the Open Meeting Act require that the entity has to have public comment? They have to listen to me.
So many public bodies provide a forum for public comment. Sometimes that is to be able to participate directly in the meeting right then, like to be able to talk and say like, yes, I want to approve this zoning and I encourage you to do so, city councilors. But there's no like fast written rule or hard written rule that has to be a requirement. And I certainly think that that is an area where it is lacking. I would love to see a provision that required for comment. I think many local ordinances. So for example, if I'm in a town and we have our local ordinances or local law that might go above and beyond that, there certainly might be instances where public comment is required to be taken or heard or things like that. But unfortunately, it's not included in really the text of the Open Meeting Act itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think I often think about episodes of Parks and Rec where it was a public forum. There was a town hall that was designed for public comment, and people are, I think, in the real world, are always nervous that their public meeting is going to turn into a Parks and Rec style free for all with comments that are way off base. But I think the takeaway, right, is that it is up to the entity whether or not to allow public comment, and they can set limits on, 3 minutes per person or whatever. Now, if they make changes to that is different from how they've always operated, or if it deviates from any kind of set rules they have, that's a different matter. But as far as the law goes itself, the Open Meeting Act, there's not that requirement in there right now.
Right, unfortunately.
Right, yeah. That came up a lot, especially in the last year when things shifted from in-person to virtual. So entities who typically would have like a public comment section or time for an in-person meeting were just trying to make the meetings happen and like would stream them, but there wasn't always especially in the beginning, a good mechanism for public comment. And there was a lot of concern that that might be a way that public entities would hide from the public, that boards and commissions could hold a meeting and not have to be as accountable to the public as they might otherwise.
Absolutely. I think we saw a lot of kind of interesting developments throughout the course of the pandemic. And I am excited and hopeful to kind of see these regular meetings get back into their normal state. But do hope that a lot of these public bodies will kind of continue also offering maybe digital offerings that will expand kind of who can come and participate in their meetings or watch. I think it's really great if maybe you want to watch a meeting for the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, but you're not, located near their office or wherever their meeting's going to be held in Oklahoma City. It did at least present a unique opportunity for other people to participate who might not traditionally be able to get into each one of those meetings. So I hope to see that kind of in conjunction with the getting back to the normal in-person meetings.
Yeah, I do too. And I really hope, I think the last year, this pandemic has shown us that there are lots of ways to do this and to do it well, right? And so, to be fair, a minute ago, I mentioned that the legislature is not subject to open records. They're not subject to Open Meeting Act either, correct?
Correct.
I didn't want to speak out of turn, but I will say that they do stream all of the floor proceedings for both the House and the Senate and all their committee meetings. They obviously don't stream their caucus meetings; those are private. But it allows someone like me to be at home and to stay up on these meetings, and in some cases of the last year, even participate when they had, some public digital virtual town halls about redistricting, those kinds of things. And so I think there are, as technology has improved, there are more and more ways for the public to be involved. So that's, I think, really exciting. Now, one thing that comes up is what you mentioned earlier of public boards and commissions having to post notice about their meetings in advance. If you are an everyday Oklahoman who is trying to find out, when a specific council, board, commission is going to meet, how do you go about finding that information out?
Yeah, so I think a lot of public bodies have websites or other kind of electronic forums where they tend to make that information available due to accessibility. So that's a great way if for example, you're trying to find out when the city of Muskogee is going to have a meeting. I would certainly check and see if they have a website. But if not, they're supposed to, provide notice of their regular meetings for basically the entire year in advance. So like they meet the third Thursday of every month or whenever, at kind of their principal place of business. So wherever if there's a city hall or something like that, as well as, or the meeting location itself. A lot of times those are kind of similar areas or maybe in the same building or things like that. But there should be kind of a public notice posted in the principal place of business. But I think that you should be able to find a lot of that information on a Facebook page, on a website, or things like that, that are kind of controlled by that public body.
Sure. So a simple amount of Googling might yield that result you're looking for. Now, some agencies have to send notice to the Secretary of State. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so some of them have to send notice to the Secretary of State about their regularly scheduled meetings. So that's always a way too that you can find kind of the schedule in advance, because a lot of them will set for like, these are our regularly scheduled meetings for the year 2021. So that's a great way to know, like, if I'm trying to line up dates for things that I want to put on my calendar and make sure I have a chance to attend, I can take note of maybe those notices that have been provided or find it elsewhere.
Sure. Now, some entities might have special meetings, right, that occur outside of their normal schedule, particularly as they are, I don't know, responding to a pandemic or something. And those notices would be posted in the same places, but the time frame, the requirement of like how much notice they have to give before the meeting is different for special meetings than for regular meetings. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we want our government to be effective. And for example, if a levee breaks in your town, you don't want to have to be like, oh, well, we just missed the regular meeting last week and we're not going to be able to do anything about this, or vote on extra expenditures needed to address this problem. You want your government to be able to be effective and responsive. So certainly government bodies can have what is known as a special meeting or emergency meeting to address specific issues that they provide advance notice of, but often that comes in a much shorter time frame, close to 48 hours in advance of that meeting. And that will usually be in addition to their regularly scheduled meetings.
Sure. Now, part of the meeting notice is like just the notice of the meeting itself, like, hey, we're going to meet at this day and time in this location, but they also have to produce an agenda for the meeting. And there's been several examples, right, about where a meeting agenda may or may not have, in the minds of at least some folks, accurately described what was going to be discussed at that meeting. Can you talk about that issue a little bit?
Yeah, so part of being able to, be fully informed and be able to participate in these government meetings is knowing what's going on at them, knowing what to expect when you show up so that you can be prepared with your opinions or comments or, however you want to prepare for the meeting. So I think certainly we've seen a recent example of this with the case in Norman, where public bodies are required to post agendas talking about, what they're going to discuss in their meeting. And in that case, there was a dispute over whether an agenda item provided adequate notice that a certain provision would be up for debate and vote, and it regarded the city's budget. So an interest group in Norman challenged that, and essentially what can happen under the Open Records or under the Open Meetings Act, is that any kind of action that is taken can be voided if it's found to be without that adequate notice. So I think what we saw there was a debate over whether a provision providing notice about that the budget would be approved or declined was adequate to provide notice that there would maybe be debate about reallocation or changing funding within that budget. And we saw in that case that the court said that that was not sufficient to put the public on notice by saying that you were going to vote on approving or denying, when in actuality what happened was maybe a reallocation of the budget.
Yeah. So this is, I think, has been a really fascinating few weeks related to this issue, and just talking and thinking about it with a lot of people. There's, if you are on a council of some kind, right? You're on the Norman City Council and you're going to be discussing the budget, and the agenda says, discussion and possible action about approving the budget. And then you get there and there's discussion about the budget in the meeting. And then during the meeting, the decision goes one way or another, right? This, how do you know? Like, you can't always anticipate, like, what if, I guess, during the meeting, there's discussion and people's minds weren't made up before they came to the meeting. And after some, we debated this for a while, and so now we're going to decide to shift funding from this department to this department. And if an entity or an outside group said, hang on, that wasn't on the agenda. You didn't say you were going to, defund or change funding here. Does this ruling so far, does this have any implications for how that process happens? Like, does it essentially mean that a body has to already have their minds made up and just come and carry it out the way they had already intended to, or does it allow for them to debate and discuss and make changes along the way?
Yeah, I think that certainly it allows room for kind of both of those, as long as it's sufficiently clear. That was kind of the my understanding of the general argument, as whether or not the actual item that was posted on the agenda, that language, whether it was sufficiently clear to let people know, hey, we're considering a debate on how we should allocate money within the city, versus, hey, we're considering approving or denying the budget.
Right.
So as long as, they're sufficiently clear on, we will be taking debate or discussing the, expenditure of giving the county hospital like an extra $300,000, and we'll move to approve or deny the budget at the end of that. As long as they're sufficiently clear, they can certainly continue having those debates or discussions. That's an essential, form of governance. So they can absolutely continue, but as long as they provide adequate notice to the public, including us, of what's going on, so that we can also participate.
Right. Because somebody asked me, well, what happens if they're discussing it, they think they're going one direction, and a member makes a motion to go a different direction? Well, they could also then, they could still discuss it, but they might also motion to delay the vote and have a follow-up meeting in a week or 2 weeks or a month, to allow the public some time to chime in on that. And that, yes, does slow down how things happen. But in some cases, we like government to move slowly because we like to be involved, and maybe that allows for greater transparency.
Yeah, I think that's a really great kind of insight into the process, that when it's about letting the people participate in their own government, that yes, we absolutely, I think, should make provision to help that happen.
Yeah, yeah, it is tough, especially if a levee broke. Do we even have any levees in Oklahoma? I'm sure we do, but if a levee broke, we want quick action. But if we're trying to plan out how to spend millions of dollars over the next 12 months, maybe we should take an extra week to talk about it in some cases. All right, great. Well, so it's 12:40 right now. We got a little bit of time left. Audience, if you're watching, I want to remind you, please submit your questions. Thank you to those who already have. And so while we wait for folks to type in their questions, let's touch on the subject of EPIC charter schools, because as we said, there's been some concern on kind of both sides, both Open Records and Open Meeting Act. And I know that you've had a role in that. So I'm going to let you kind of describe what those allegations are and where things are at, and maybe how this is if nothing else, this is an excellent example to illustrate how the Open Records Act and Open Meeting Act apply to a public or semi-public entity.
Yeah, so I think, like we kind of discussed at the beginning a little bit, we're fortunate that our transparency laws here in Oklahoma reach all the way down to, the local government entities that we probably interact with the most on a daily basis, the places where we send our kids to school, where we're students at, our city and our towns. And so that's no different with public schools across the state. So in the case of EPIC charter schools, and I would like to be extremely clear here that I'm actually the attorney representing Oklahoma Watch and Jennifer Palmer in this matter. We recently filed a lawsuit yesterday under the State Open Records Act law, alleging several violations by EPIC charter schools of that law, and seeking to get a court to make a determination about those disagreements, which included kind of unlawful practices that we're alleging under the law, as well as kind of unlawful fee assessments.
Yeah, so there's kind of a lot to go on to that, and it'll play out in the courts, right? Now, I guess it's somewhat related to EPIC, but a few weeks ago there was a state, is it the State Board of Education? Yeah, State Board of Education meeting where they made a decision about some charter school settlement, and there were people who said that meeting, that decision, how they went into executive session for I think 5 hours, and then came out and kind of said, okay, here's what we decided. That whole process didn't follow the Open Meeting Act. Did you follow that situation at all? And do you have any insight into that for us?
Yeah, so I'm not, super familiar with the exact facts of the case. The only thing that I would note is that kind of one exception to public bodies making their meetings available through the Open Meetings Act is they are allowed to adjourn into what is called an executive session for specific reasons. Oftentimes you might see that for a public body, say a city, to be able to consult with legal counsel about an action that they should take. And then often you will see them come back in and make a vote. And it doesn't seem quite clear about what happened. Unfortunately, you didn't see the discussion between the attorney and the client taking place. It sounds like maybe something similar happened here, but I'm not intimately familiar with what happened in that case and haven't followed it extremely closely.
Sure, yeah. I think the whole premise or existence of executive sessions is a bit of a black hole for a lot of the public, right? Like they know it's a thing, but as soon as a public body goes into executive session, they feel like they're trying to hide from them, right? And now there are legitimate reasons to do that. And in fact, in order to go into executive session, they have to make a motion and vote to do it, and they have to have it for a specific reason, right? And that reason has to be listed or known. And then when they come out, they have to give some summary of what was decided in that executive session, if anything.
Yeah, so that's exactly how we usually see it play out is, they'll say, we're going into executive session, somebody makes the motion, it might be approved. It's going to be for a specific reason. Like, let's say I'm, the city councilor for, I don't know, wherever, Jones. And maybe I want to get legal advice from our attorney. Maybe somebody slipped and fell at City Hall and we have to figure out what's going to happen. We've been sued. There are maybe specific reasons why an attorney-client relationship is kept privileged. So that is kind of one example where you might see that. And then we're going to come back out and say maybe whatever we decided in the executive session, we'll make a public record of our decision there, but you don't really get to see that entire discussion about what do we know about this guy who slipped and fell? What's his history? Do we think he's really litigious? Do we think he's serious? Could we settle with him? You kind of see that ultimate conclusion without kind of showing all of the work.
Right. Same thing with Open Records Act. There are certain things, as you mentioned, that are excluded, right? Like personnel records and some of those things that are not subject to public review. Related to that, we've got a question here that says, how long does an entity have to fill an open records request? And then what's the consequences for an entity who's found to be in violation of Open Records or Open Meeting Act, either one?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I will say, regarding that first question, how long does an entity have to fulfill an open records request? The statute itself says that public bodies must provide prompt and reasonable access to their records. So there's no kind of, per se, it must be 10 days or something like that. It's supposed to be the actual time it takes to fulfill that record without disrupting kind of the essential functions of that public body. So for example, I'm thinking of at least one case where under the prior administration with Governor Fallon, my organization, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, represented the journalists Ziva Brandstetter and the Tulsa World in a lawsuit against Governor Fallon and the Department of Public Safety for delaying access to public records. And in that case, we were able to get a court to find that a delay of 17 months was unreasonable. And in that case, the governor's office just truly did not respond to the request and basically kept saying we're working on it, we're working on it. And the courts were like, okay, this is too long. And so it really, your recourse in that situation, if you feel like, you have a records request that's just sitting stagnant, is to try and, press that public body and let them know the law requires you to provide me prompt and reasonable access. Could I maybe come and inspect the records? Is there anything I can do on my end to try and speed up the process? And if you continue to get pushback, then try and find an attorney who might be able to take your case to a court for a judge to kind of resolve that issue for you.
Yeah, sure. Another question back to the Epic situation, and let me know if you don't feel like you can answer this due to pending litigation. But can an entity like Epic or others charge for a quote legal review of an open records request?
Yeah, so I would say on that, maybe not even in the specific facts of the case with Epic, but the Open Records Act does not have any provision about charging legal review fees or passing that cost on to requesters in order to fulfill Open Records Act requests. And the act itself is very clear that public agencies and public bodies are not supposed to use fees to discourage requests or fulfillment of requests. And the only fees that are kind of contemplated by the Open Records Act are copying fees, which in a lot of cases, if I'm going to let's say the county courthouse and I want to get a case file, it's 6 pages. Under the law, I could be charged a maximum of 25 cents per page. There are some different provisions. For example, if I'm a newscaster getting some electronic media from a public agency, that's a different provision. Agencies are also allowed to charge what is known as a search fee in some cases, but that's primarily if, like, let's say I was the owner of mugshots.com and it was my business to collect, mugshots, which are public records in the state of Oklahoma, and I'm using that for a business purpose. And maybe, I'm having to work with the Department of Corrections or local county jails to set up a system to send those to me automatically or something like that, then they can charge me kind of the reasonable costs that go into compiling that information because I'm using it for kind of a commercial purpose.
Interesting. The other night I was watching an episode of The Wire, which I know went off the air like a decade ago, but I had never watched it. And a couple of the police officers went in somewhere and they were trying to, I don't know, it's, they're trying to circumvent the system somehow. That's a bunch of the of the show. But they sought some records, and the response was basically, it's going to cost however much money to copy them, but we'll just give them to you here. You can use your phone to take a picture of it. Is that a real thing that exists in the real world? Like if some entity was like, it's going to cost you $10 for copies and it'll take us 2 weeks, but you could just come on down here and take a photo of it. Like if it's a book or a printed out thing that you could see, is that a viable solution or a possibility?
Yeah, so I think that that's a great way. And it's certainly something that I kind of advise journalists in my line of work a lot of times, because they rely on these laws to really do their news gathering. So a lot of times to see if a public body is like playing games with them or just trying to stall out a request, I'll advise that instead of just asking for copies of the records, one, they go ask to just inspect them in person or show up wherever the public body is and say, can I please take a look at this case file or whatever I'm interested in. And then two, yeah, if you can, instead of saying, give me all the copies and I'll, look through and decide what's relevant to me, if you have a chance to go in person and inspect the records, yeah, absolutely. Use your phone. You're allowed to, if you can take a little copier, the law says you can take a little copier with you and make copies at your own expense. You just can't do something that's going to like destroy the original record itself. But that's definitely a great way to try, and if you're in a time crunch trying to get those records or trying to get them in the most like financially prudent way possible, definitely a strategy to consider.
Yeah, man, that makes me think about when I was in college 20 years ago and before camera phones, right? And if you went to the library, you had to bring your bag of dimes with you because it was 10 cents a page to copy stuff so you could go back to your dorm room and write your paper. But now everyone's got laptops and camera phones and it's all much easier. I could have saved a lot of money on research. One other question here. I think we may be getting maybe 2 questions left, and then we'll wrap up here. So one is about a local police department record manager that had received multiple requests for records that, according to this person, fall under those categories that were eligible, and each time received a generic response from the police department records manager that said, these records are not available for release at this time. So 2 parts to that. Is that a common response? And how should someone respond if that's what the response they get?
Yeah, so unfortunately, that is kind of a common occurrence. There are absolutely really great, public information officers out there who really pride themselves on making government transparent and accessible, and they're a pleasure to work with. But I often find lots of government officials that I interact with are just maybe not educated about the Open Records Act or what it requires, or even if, they're presented with that information, even if I say in a respectful manner, this is what the law requires of you, they're just kind of like, don't have time for that, or just ignore it. And that's really frustrating. And I'm sorry to everybody who finds themselves in that situation. Typically what I do with my clients who are journalists is I will try to reach out to that person, try to provide them with, can you please give me a specific reason they're not available? The law requires you to provide this. And, I'm an attorney. So often when I'm working with my clients, I say things like, we will consider our options, maybe filing a lawsuit to enforce our rights under the Open Records Act. Now, I don't think I would recommend that for you to just like throw that out with a bunch of people, but absolutely letting them know that the law requires them to provide you with this. It's their burden to tell you why they won't. And answers like, these records are not available for release at this time, that is not sufficient. They have to give you a reason why. Were the records destroyed? Are they saying that the records are, not subject to release ever? Like maybe they're claiming they're exempt. They have to give you that reason, or else you could take that matter to court, get a judge to decide in your favor, and then they're going to be paying for that.
Right. Yeah. Simply, I don't want to is not a viable reason to not turn over records that are required to be released by law. And then one last question. What is considered an undue disruption for an entity to charge a requester?
Yeah, I think that is going to be a really specific fact analysis that will have to take place to answer that question. I'm trying to think. There are several cases on this point in Oklahoma case law. One of them, for example, talked about a private company that was seeking to get some type of records from, I believe it was the Department of Corrections, and it was a request that would take like some maybe in those days like coding, their version of coding, and creating a software and a program that could pull this information and provide it to this private company. That might be something that would be disruptive if it kept the Oklahoma Department of Corrections from performing their essential functions of corrections, to provide prison facilities and other law enforcement activities.
Sure. I think about examples where like someone's requesting emails from someone, right? And if you say, I want copies of every email that uses the word budget between January 1st and December 31st, like from the governor's office, like you're going to get hundreds, thousands of emails, right? That's going to take a lot of time to sort through, to redact and do whatever else to get you that result. That's very different than I need the emails between this person and this person in this 4-day window. And that's a much easier request. And so there's a different amount of like manpower involved in fulfilling one of those requests, and that could result in disruption of services.
Yeah, and I would just say too that a lot of our government is advancing and has better technologies every year. So maybe requests that would have been burdensome and disruptive like years ago, when we didn't have the technology available to us today that we do, might not be so disruptive today. I'm aware of cases where state agencies have provided people with 6,000 emails and stuff like that, and it's not a problem for them because they're able to narrow by time frame or keywords or things like that. And I think it matters most if you are the requester, how quickly you want to get that information. Obviously, it's going to take a lot longer to process 60,000 emails than like 6. So I think if you can refine your emails or refine your request to, for example, instead of saying like, I want, all emails between the governor and any agency that mention like the commissioner of public safety or something like that could get a lot of hits, and that might be doable, but it might take a long time to respond. You can use creative ways to try and narrow your request and get the information that you want much faster to you. I think it'll be a more pleasant process for you and the government official who's working to fulfill your request.
Yeah, I agree. Katie Beth, thank you so much for being here today and for all of your information. Attendees and listeners, whoever's at home, thank you for being here as well. That's why we're doing this, is for you. And in fact, next month, we'll be back on June 9th, again with Katie Beth and some other guests to talk about that very issue of how to submit an open records request. I think there's a lot of skills that just, a lot of reporters know how to do this, but the public, I think, forgets that we can submit requests too. And when it's you and you're trying to get records on your own, or you're, to help a family member or something, it can feel like you're swimming in the ocean. And we want to try to make it a little easier to digest for everybody. As I mentioned at the top of the show, we'll have a bunch of other lunch and learns throughout the rest of the year, trying to cover this, the topic of transparency from various angles that are useful to the public. So please invite your friends, tell them to come, and we'll see you again next month.
Thanks everyone.
Everybody.